Hey guys, welcome back to the Bad Chinese Teacher Podcast. It's Patricia. I hope you guys have been having a good week. If you have the day off today because it's Martin Luther King Day, I hope you're also enjoying your day off. I have the day off. I'm actually recording this Sunday night, the night before this episode is due to go out. So I apologize that this episode is probably going to sound pretty haphazard. I have zero notes for this episode, partially by design, partially because, I don't know, I procrastinated hard. And I feel kind of like bad because if you read the title of this episode, it feels like an episode that has some weight to it, is kind of about important issues that you shouldn't just like wing an episode on. But the reason why I feel like a little bit justified in just kind of going off the cuff tonight is because I feel like a lot of what this episode is going to touch upon is about authenticity. And I feel like, scripting things out. I tend to over-script things. Believe it or not, a lot of my episode preparation notes span literal pages, like 3 to 4 single-spaced pages, which is just, I don't know. I mean, it's not an efficient use of time, but I decided, this being a topic that I have a lot of thoughts on, care deeply about. If there's an episode to, be authentic without having to, and not have to prepare pages of notes out of this, imagined anxiety that I had that I'll say something wrong or run out of things to say. That won't happen. But I figured why not give it a shot. So that's one reason. But the other reason is I'm actually coming off. I literally just got home 7 minutes ago. I was at school on a Sunday night. Believe it or not. And the reason why I was at school at Sunday night is because the school that I work at, we took a bunch of kids to a screening of a movie that came out about a week and a half ago called Just Mercy. If you haven't gone to see this film yet, please do. If anything, because I feel like this is one of those films is going to be in the public lexicon, the cultural lexicon for a while now. I'd be super surprised that it isn't, nominated for a bunch of awards and stuff. It's a very, very good film. Based off of a true story. It tells a story of a Harvard-educated lawyer called Brian Stevenson, who kind of leaves the promise of having this really successful career in law, to work in, the southern part of the United States, working towards, achieving justice for incarcerated folks, particularly folks who are on death row. And so the movie is kind of a dramatization of one of the cases he worked on, involving a man who was falsely accused of murdering a white woman in Alabama. It just talks about that, but it really also just speaks into, a lot of the deep injustices that are in place in the American justice system, and with mass incarceration. It's a lot. I will definitely say that, but I think I don't know, if you're a human that cares about justice, or if you're just if you're a human, you should go see this film. And so I took that piece of advice and I applied it. We applied it to me and a couple of colleagues applied it to the students at our school, and which kind of after some discussion led to this kind of field trip on the weekend to the local movie theater to go take kids to see this movie. And after the movie, we had a talk back on campus, which I was a part of. So that's what I'm coming off the tails off of. And so I felt, given the topic of this week's episode, as well as what is on my mind and on my heart right now, let's just talk, man. The topic of this episode has to do with racial justice, talking about racial justice in the world language classroom, particularly about the Chinese language classroom, which are two things that I think if you're an educator, social justice is something that is part and parcel to education. I really feel if you're an educator, social justice, racial justice needs to be a part of your pedagogical lexicon, for a wide variety of really well justified reasons. But I think when it comes to world language, depending on the language, that can feel really intuitive in some cases and really unintuitive. unintuitive, unnatural in other cases. And I feel like the Chinese classroom is one of those places where it does feel very unintuitive. But I'm going to talk about like how this applies to the Chinese classroom a little bit later on. I want to talk a little bit more about kind of like what I do at my school and why I, as a Chinese teacher, wound up spending my Sunday afternoon, evening, talking to a bunch of students at my school about mass incarceration and racial justice. So I work at a Christian school. Evangelical Christian school, of which, depending on your social circle, probably a bunch of things come to your mind. First and foremost, I think what it's real. I need to say that I love my school. I'm indebted to my school. It's actually that school where I learned that my calling in life is to become a teacher. And so there's so many things about my school that I am really thankful for. And that's just full stop. There is no but after that. It's a really great place to be a student where like you feel like or in theory, right, and that all parts of your life, someone is speaking into all of those parts, right? Whether it's your intellect, your academics, but also like your emotional state, your spiritual state. Obviously, since it's a religiously affiliated school, so I really love my school. The reason why I love my school is because it's one of those places. I think part and parcel of working at a religiously affiliated school, a faith-based school, one thing that you kind of get to do that might not be as easy to do in secular schools, is this idea that it's okay, if not, no, it's encouraged to talk about what is right and what is wrong, which sounds like a really like basic thing. But I think if you're someone who's ever like seriously thought about becoming an educator, that thing in itself, that very simple thing becomes very, very tricky, because if you're a teacher, right, like there is a part of you that needs to stay impartial to a lot of things. Your role as a teacher is to kind of deliver material and make sure that, your students learn it, and become educated, quote unquote, humans. But that kind of lies contradictory at times to the reason why so many people become or choose to become educators. And people choose to become educators because they have a vested interest in our future, right? And we want our future to be in the hands of people who are, yes, well educated, but also like, have a rightful, have a view, are willing to work towards a better future, right? Or have a strong enough sense of like a moral center that they can work towards a future that is brighter, right, and better. I think a lot of educators at least have that in common. I don't know of many teachers who have made it have survived in their field, who look at their career and are just like, yep, my job is to just deliver content. I don't really care how these kids turn out in the future. I don't really care about like what kind of future they shape our world to be. My job is just to teach blah, blah, blah. And I just go like, I don't know. I don't know that many people who have managed to stay teachers, who look at their careers like that. I think all of us who are in it for the long run have teach because we have a vested interest in, making sure that our students inherit values and a sense of morality that is instrumental in making sure that our like planet and our like societies survive and thrive. And so that being kind of like where a lot of teachers start at, it feels very. I imagine it can feel very like frustrating to then be in a role where you feel like you need to be like neutral in a lot of places. It's not to say that in Christian schools that need does not like that sort of like ethic doesn't exist. But I think at the same time, there are things where you can kind of, at Christian school, you can kind of say, guys, this is the right thing to do because the gospel, because Jesus, and point kids in that direction. That you might not be able to do that as straightforwardly in public school. I think there are still ways. It's not to say, I'm not saying that like Christian school does a great just a great job of pointing kids towards like proper morality. I think a lot of the times you might be able to make an opposite argument depending on the place you're talking about. But I would say that like it's easier to get to the point, I would say, in Christian school. And so I consider myself really fortunate for my first teaching job to be at a Christian school, being who I am. being honestly as unpolished of an educator as I am, to be able and lacking the skills to be able to like kind of instill in my students that kind of like moral imperative, in a strategic and not, in a more straightforward way. And so anyway, getting back to what happened tonight. So we took the kids to go see this screening. I wasn't able to make it, but I saw the movie myself a week ago, and just kind of came back for the talk back. And the talk back was really just kind of like a space. Like, I mean, when I watched the movie, I was like, after I watched it, I just called up my colleague and like just needed to talk about it for like half an hour, just because the movie is very, very heavy and there's just so much to process. And I figured that if I, as an adult who regularly engages with these issues, needed that space, then by golly, my 15, 16, 17-year-old students need that space as well, for sure. And so the real purpose behind this talkback was just to create that space. There really wasn't any sort of like messaging that we had in mind, but I came out of it just feeling really hopeful, which is interesting to say, because it's like usually it's easy to come out of like something like this and feel less hopeful just because of how complicated things can be, right? I'll be the first to say that like evangelical communities this is not like racial justice and, American evangelical communities. It's something that has only just come into our community space in recent years, and reluctantly so. For various reasons. I think if you're not a Christian, I think that is not surprising. If you are a Christian, particularly if you're a Christian of color who has been in racial justice spaces, secular or otherwise, for quite some time, like me, your reaction's like, wow, took us long enough to start dialoguing about how, Jesus as a radical in his time and era, how he lived his life is applicable to the injustices that are happening in and around us today. But I think coming out of the discussion, I think the one takeaway that I really had was like listening to my students talk, who again, like these guys are like born in like 2003 or so, like far after the events of, this movie, Just Mercy, who those true events took place in like 1992. And so it was just really great to hear my students be able to articulate what was happening in the world around them, and how something like, what's happening with mass incarceration amongst people of color, how that is directly applicable to not just their own lives, but the lives of their friends, the lives of people they care about. Guys, I mean, say what you say about say what you might about young people nowadays, but I've, being a teacher, working in high school for this amount of time, whenever I have a chance to bear witness to conversations like these, it just strengthens my faith that like, man, like this new generation of kids gets it. On the one hand, they're 15, 16, 17. I think back to when I was 15, 16, 17, and how much of an idiot I was. And on the one hand, you're always thinking like, how do you challenge your students more? How do you get them to think deeper? But on the other hand, I'm just like, man, these kids are thinking on a much deeper level than I was at their age. And to push them further now, only like I'm grateful enough to who they are already and what they're thinking about, who and what they care about. And we're just so, yeah, I mean, I'm not that old, but I'm grateful to be living in the same universe where I can look towards my own students and see a bright future. And so that's kind of what I saw tonight. I saw a bright future with what my students were saying and how they were reacting to what was in front of them and how open they were to listening to each other, man. I'm just like, I'm floored every time. I'm so grateful that I get to see all of this. And to be able to do that at again, at an evangelical Christian school, I mean, I don't know where you guys are coming from. I don't know what your feelings are about religious spaces, Christian schools like that. But, believe me when I say that, like, whatever skepticism anyone might have about, evangelical spaces like that, yeah, I get them. I share them. But a lot of what has happened in and around my life working at a Christian school for the past 6 years has been testimony to me that, like, good stuff happens. Really good stuff happens. Stuff that you might not expect to be good happens. Doesn't mean it's not challenging. It doesn't mean it's not frustrating, but I think it's just, yeah, yeah, don't as a skeptical person, right? Like, there are times where the skepticism, you really are humbled by what you see. And so I'm just coming off the tails of that, and I'm realizing how important it is to engage with students at every level through this. We're looking at this through the lens of Martin Luther King Day, which is again tomorrow. So if you're, or today, if you're like listening to this when it comes out, and its applicability, or rather like social justice as a whole, in the world language classroom. I feel like this is a topic that, whenever I'm at like world language teacher conferences, like, I love hopping over to those seminars, usually in the context of like the Spanish classroom. If not Spanish, then it's French. The connection with the Spanish language classroom is very immediate, given the political climate in the U.S. today. And so the connection between that and social justice, very, very obvious to draw that connection. With French, maybe a little less so, but if you think about what's happening in Northern Africa, the connections aren't hard to make. You'll ask any world language teacher, I think it's impossible to divorce, like world language is one of those places that, like I mentioned in a previous episode, if your social studies curriculum is as America-centric as a lot of American social studies curriculum tend to be, and yes, there's a good reason for that. Check previous episodes and we'll talk about why. But that's kind of where the world language classroom is kind of where you get your education about non-American cultures and histories, and understanding that a culture and history that is outside of your own is such an integral part of understanding how to, or even like beginning to empathize with social justice issues, if only because social justice, like, being involved in social justice, or really, even if we don't want to put that label on it, being involved in like empathy towards the cause of bettering the well-being of humans everywhere, that the first step in engaging in that is being able to step into being willing to step into a culture, environment, a space that is not yours. And that's where empathy starts to, that's where you start to grow empathy. And I've had, on this podcast, we've had lots of discussions with various people who have learned and have been teaching world languages. And every single one of those discussions, what always comes up is the connection between learning a language and then gaining not just an appreciation, but a deep empathy, a deep connection, a deep sense of belonging with a new set of people who you might otherwise not have any connection with. You talked about this a lot with Rachel, and how that is, what compels her teaching as a Spanish and now a French teacher. And so I think, the natural connection is not just because of like what's on paper, right? You learn about immigration issues in Spanish class because the discussion surrounding immigration nowadays involves Spanish-speaking people. Those are the obvious connections, but really it comes down to like in order for you to justify your willingness to learn a language, or rather what like keeps you going when you're learning a language is a desire to connect with people. And if you connect with people, then you connect with the causes that concern those people. And that's kind of where empathy comes in, right? And so if we're looking at this from like a, language acquisition sort of view, right? A big part of like that, what happens when students plateau, when they kind of like hit that first sort of like, I'm kind of running out of things to learn sort of phase, but I'm not actually at peak proficiency yet. I feel like a lot of what characterizes that plateau is hopping between the gap between like I'm learning this language in like a vacuum to I'm connecting with authentic people, the actual like the living language, right? And so in order to like hop over that, that divide, that gap, I feel like, and I think this kind of speaks a little bit into my own personal experience with learning Chinese. But a big part of that like empathy gap, it's like the empathy part needs to come in first almost, it's like, I don't know. I guess if you were to talk about this, I were to talk about this with me learning Chinese, it was kind of like, you learn enough Chinese to, to feel semi-competent. But then it's kind of like, oh, but I want to be able to read news stories. Like I'm kind of tired of having to like read translated news, for things involving, the Chinese speaking world. And so in order to kind of like access those, that side of things, like things beyond just like, I don't know, like buy a train ticket, things of that magnitude, to be able to truly access, parts of the language and parts of the culture that are accessible to like native speakers, you kind of, that's kind of like what ends up pushing your desire to learn the language, past that point. At least that was the case for me. And that's actually something that kind of like, even though, I don't know, but maybe you could say that the plateau never ends. I feel like after a certain point, you kind of like lose momentum a little bit, and everything else, like, your growth ends up slowing down, and you have to kind of like push yourself harder to kind of like, progress further. Honestly, for me, like what keeps my desire to improve on my Chinese even further is the fact that like, I'm a very slow reader in Chinese, like comically slow. Comically slow. And so one of the things that like, and the reason why my reading is so slow is because I just don't like read enough. And so one of the things that like compels me to like, continue reading, keep reading and practice my reading is like I mentioned before, is the fact that like, I want to keep up with what's happening politically, and sociologically and culturally in Taiwan. And part of being able to do that is being able to read the news. And so, being able, and a lot of that news is not translated into English. I mean, some of it is, but a lot of it, especially if you want it quickly, especially if you want it like, as it's happening, is only in Chinese. And so that's kind of what keeps my language practice up, is this desire, is this innate, like pre-existing desire to understand what's happening in the Chinese speaking world. And that comes from, deeply caring about what happens in the Chinese speaking world. And so just from a purely pedagogical standpoint, a big part of like what keeps your ability to continue learning language is wanting to access those authentic materials. And those the most compelling of authentic materials, at least in my opinion, are things that are current and things that are relevant. And that to me is just news and politics and history and all. I mean, not history, but like, history as it applies to politics and all those things, like cultural and sociological context, right? And so in that sense, right, then like social justice issues, human interest issues, are part and parcel to the world language learning experience, because that's actually those are the authentic materials that we talk about when we talk about giving students authentic materials to work off of. They all have to do with people. And so you don't like, the two kind of just have to go together. When your classroom is pointed in that direction, then like when you can make a good pedagogical case for involving social justice in your classroom, because, let alone, never mind the fact that like, kids nowadays, for the better are involved, are cognizant of, these political issues regardless. If you present to them a version of the culture that is static and just kind of like just defined by cultural artifacts that seem to not be connected to any sort of human, I don't know of many people that would find that compelling. In my experience, it's like, the moment where culture comes alive is when it's connected to actual humans, right? And so, if you're looking for like, the reason why your students are not connecting with like your culture lessons, I think that's one thing that I keep asking myself, right? Is this connected to like actual people? Does this have a human face that my students can connect with? Because if not, then like, why even, why bother? But anyway, to return back to why social justice, it makes sense in the world language classroom, I feel like this is basically a non-discussion when you talk about Spanish or French classrooms. I feel like the everything that I've said just now, it's pretty much stating the obvious. I'm just making a point for like why, even if you're someone who like doesn't feel like social justice has any place in any, I don't know, academic setting, there's a pedagogical, language acquisition argument to be made in terms of keeping authentic materials relevant and engaging with your students, at least in this day and age. And I feel like even given that argument, right, if you're a Spanish or French teacher, all of this, it makes a lot more sense. All of this feels a lot more immediately applicable. It's almost as if like, why are we even having this conversation? Because the two and two just kind of, go together. But with Chinese classrooms, like, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I came out and I set out wanting to do this episode because it's Martin Luther King Day, right? And Martin Luther King Day is something that, like, if you're in public school in the United States or any school in the United States, right? Because of his significance as a historic, as such an important figure in American history, his presence, his legacy, ought to leave a mark in every aspect of, or at least Black history as a whole, ought to leave a mark in every single academic class, right? Even if you're in a science class, you can talk about prominent Black scientists who, don't get enough like recognition for what they do because history, or the same thing could be said about math. The same thing could be said about like, all those subjects that aren't necessarily civics related. And then with world language, again, if you're teaching like, Spanish or even French, where the social justice, racial justice angle seems just a lot more relevant, it's not hard to make those connections. But like for me as a Chinese teacher, if you were to ask me, like if you're to say, okay, you got to integrate Black history into your Chinese classroom, I mean, even for me as someone who, considers themselves to be, relatively invested in, teaching kids tolerance and teaching kids social justice in the classroom as a matter of like civically educating them. I've always said that the primary reason why, bar none, why I feel like it's a moral obligation for me to teach well as long as I'm teaching in the U.S. is because I know that all of my students, if they're American citizens, will need to vote in the future. And that burden is a solemn burden and a heavy burden and not an insignificant burden. And the reason why we're able to have this democratic system where every single citizen, regardless of educational background or personal background or whatever, is entitled to that one vote is because of the ubiquity of education. And so that's why I feel it's incumbent upon me to like not do a bad job because of this, what I feel to be a somewhat sacred duty. That being the case, I would have a hard time answering the question, how are you going to integrate Black history into your Chinese teaching? Like I feel like any immediate knee-jerk sort of response I have to that question is a bad answer. The knee-jerk response that I'm thinking of right now is like, I don't know, all the terrible racist things that happen to Black folks whenever they travel in China, or maybe even East Asia as a whole. Like that's really like one of the only like knee-jerk directly relevant responses that I would have. It just doesn't seem all that easy to replicate unless you really do some like real digging. I don't know, since we're at a Christian school, maybe you find like a Black missionary who did work in China. I can't think of any. There are a lot of white missionaries. I can't think of any Black missionaries. I think I'd be really surprised if I found one. But stuff of that nature. And so, I at least at this juncture in my career, I don't have enough faith in myself to really make that clear of a connection and make an entire lesson on how Black history relates to learning Chinese. However, I think, that being said, this in itself opens up a lot of opportunity to talk about how do we integrate social justice or really just like thorny political issues regarding human rights and things of that nature vis-a-vis Chinese language teaching. I've said before, again, in that previously mentioned podcast episode about, this is the episode talking about that history paper that I wrote in college about teaching Chinese history in American public schools. Long story short, we don't teach Chinese history in American schools. But in that being the case, it's kind of, I made the argument saying that, like, that's why it's really important for Chinese teachers to do a good job, to do due diligence in teaching about Chinese history, at least in a meaningful way, if only because like that probably is the only real exposure that your students will ever have to Chinese history. And so when you think about it from that angle, right, I feel like it makes it even harder to maintain the case that the way that you teach Chinese culture ought to be like, teaching cultural artifacts. In fact, like if you looked at like the standards for at the actual standards for teaching culture, it actually like actively, speaks out against that, the idea of like teaching culture as, just teaching artifacts. And so to do that, I feel like a lot of times when, when you're teaching, when you think about like Chinese teachers teaching Chinese culture, what goes through your mind are those artifacts, if only because teaching things beyond those artifacts ends up being very, very politically thorny. And politics, and China ends up being really, I don't know, we're not currently at a place yet, I guess, socially, where we're discussing politics. The intersection of politics in China is really something that you can talk about without really shooting yourself in the foot from different angles multiple times. And what I'm dancing around here is the idea that, like, I don't know. I mean, just throwing the word Confucius Institute out there probably answers a lot of like the questions that I'm not asking and also simultaneously not answering. There is Chinese, number one. Okay, Chinese teaching in the U.S. is, particularly in public schools, is still, by comparison, a relatively new phenomenon. China, and that is because like China opening up to the world is a relatively new phenomenon, that only happened several decades ago. Things are moving, the globalization between Asia and the West, so to speak, is happening at a really, really fast pace. And there's a lot of things that like we just haven't had enough time to just kind of like sit down and think over the think about the philosophical ramifications of what we're doing, right? And so and again, to put it bluntly, like one of the examples of this is the idea that like there has been this like outrageously large demand for middle and high school students to learn Chinese in their public schools, and not enough like American educated whatever, right? In the same way that like a lot of Spanish and French teachers are educated in the United States, not enough homegrown, so to speak, teachers of Chinese to fill that demand. And so Chinese government has instituted these like Confucius Institutes, where they basically just send over teachers from China to teach Chinese in the United States in order to fulfill this overwhelming need for Chinese teachers. However, and so like, a lot of schools employ this, right? A lot of colleges employ this. This is a very ubiquitous thing, right? If you're someone who's studied Chinese for any amount of time, you might, if you're not studying in a Confucius Institute sponsored like program already, you've probably heard of one. You probably have friends who have been involved in it. Like, it's pretty ubiquitous, right? This is not some sort of like, insidious sort of like, underground whatever. This is pretty common. However, if you like kind of Google Confucius Institute, you'll probably find a bunch of like really, like a lot of question marks around, the so-called dubious morality, or the fact that that Confucius Institutes are sponsored by the Chinese government, and are, in the most classical sense, a form of soft power, for China, right? China enacts soft power in many, many ways throughout the world, and language instruction overseas is one of those ways. On the one hand, this should not necessarily be given kind of like, the unfair rap of being like this super like, insidious, underhanded sort of way for China to enact its influence in all over the world. Because to be honest, like if you're I don't think that teachers from China who teach through the Confucius Institute are like, agents who are just trying to like spread propaganda to unsuspecting young impressionable students. I think most teachers, being regular people, are just kind of like here to do their job of like teaching Chinese. And also, if you really want to think about it, like, just sharing their culture, sharing their experiences, sharing their love for their own country and people within the context of the language classroom. I mean, plenty of other teachers do that without being under the umbrella of the Confucius Institute. And so, in terms of like day-to-day interaction, right? Maybe that's probably what it ends up being. It just gets thornier when political issues kind of like find themselves floating into the Chinese language classroom. That's kind of like those issues tend to arise, right? Like, this can be as innocuous as like, what flags do you display in your classroom if you're teaching in a Confucius Institute classroom? How do you answer questions? Because students will ask stuff like this because they're kids and they're very blunt. They'll ask questions like, I've gotten this question like so many times, unprompted. Like, is Taiwan a part of China? Like, you will get that question point blank. How do you answer that if you're a teacher at a Confucius Institute, right? Stuff like that. And so in that sense, right, like once you realize that that is part of the greater universe that is the Chinese teaching and learning world, then the discussion between the intersection between like, social justice, human rights, blah, 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 political issues, even if you wanted to make it even more broad, and the Chinese language classroom, the discussion becomes a lot more relevant. I think, it's a good thing. The fact that this conversation that becomes a lot more complicated and moves beyond just like, oh, my job as a Chinese teacher is just to like, teach language and that's it. The value of having that conversation, I feel, is still worth the inconvenience, and the potential controversy of even bringing up the idea that learning a language is political. Again, I will preface this all by saying that, like, working at a private Christian school, I feel, again, allows me many freedoms that don't exist elsewhere. And a lot of those freedoms really rest in the fact that, I have the trust of a community and administration that allows me to teach in a way that accomplishes what I believe to be my goals, which align with our institutional goals as a school of, what the point of a Christian school education ought to be. And a lot of that really rests on like, training up kids to be, people who are committed towards making the world and community around them better, and more just. There are faith-based reasons to kind of back that up, and so that helps me in being able to kind of like navigate a lot of these political issues without having to necessarily push my own ideology onto my students. And so to go back to one of the questions that I posed earlier, that is like, kind of like a bombshell question in many classrooms, in many Chinese teaching classrooms, is like when a student asks straight up, like, is Taiwan a part of China? I think whenever I'm asked that question, it's always a great opportunity for a history lesson, because I never will answer that question straight up like yes or no, because I don't think anyone really can. But it's a really great opportunity to kind of like present the history, which takes a lot of time, I feel. Well, I mean, like, depending on how you tell it, it takes time. But in that sense, it allows students to kind of like, number one, understand the complexity behind a question like that. Number one, understand that there are such complexities geopolitically in the world. And number two, to be able to realize that, as a result of those complexities, different people can have different views on different things depending on, a variety of factors, right? Like how they're educated, where they grew up, who they identify with, things of that nature, right? And I don't think that those discussions could have really happened if I if I were not someone who prioritized my students' understanding of Chinese speaking people on the same level as their ability to speak Chinese. Otherwise, going on that like 15-minute tangent in class really doesn't seem worth it. But in my mind, it really does, because, the hope for kids to learn Chinese, at least for me, is, number one, I hope that they will be able to communicate, right? And I hope that they will be able to communicate, not because that's sort of like a flex on my part that like I have a bunch of like my little minions who can like, show off speaking Chinese. But the reason why it's important for my kids to be able to speak Chinese, is because it's important for me that they are able to one day interact with Chinese speaking people. This is particularly relevant to me personally, just because, I see firsthand the level of misunderstanding between like people who are in the Chinese speaking world and people who are not in the Chinese speaking world. The idea that like Asian people, at least in the United States, historically have been seen almost as the antithesis of everything that is American. I think that is a stereotype that is engraved onto, the American identity, so to speak. And any opportunity that can be taken for my students to be able to bridge that gap is invaluable to me. So yeah, I mean, like, it's really important, the end goal for me teaching Chinese is so that my kids can interact with Chinese speaking people on a meaningful way. But the thing is, like, what is going to compel them to do that? What's going to compel them to do that is having a vested interest in how these Chinese speaking people live and work and kind of go through their lives, and having an accurate historical picture of that seemingly very like, uncomplicated question is important to building that into them, and building that intrigue into them, realizing again that like this is, China is a complex place to be in. The Chinese speaking world is a complex place. It's a really interesting place because of those complexities. And hey, maybe entertain the idea that like in order to fully understand those complexities, you actually will need to communicate with people in their native language in order to understand it, right? Again, if we were just to talk about this from a language teaching perspective as a whole, if you're looking for reasons to compel your kids to continue learning a language, their pursuit of knowledge, their pursuit of wanting to understand a certain people group, a certain culture, a certain society is as good a reason as any. And so that's kind of like why I feel like I can justify spending time talking about, that kind of history in, without it just being kind of like a footnote in what I do, because I think it builds into students' interest in learning the language in a way that is meaningful and achieves the, the aims of what I want my students' learning outcomes to be. As me as an educator. But I think like even beyond that, right, when we're talking about things like social justice and human rights, just the other day in class, I made the choice to like, this was a very spur of the moment thing. Maybe it shouldn't have been this spur of the moment, but I felt like it was kind of the right thing to do at that time. This was with my highest level class. These are my juniors who are, kind of like peeking out at the program right now. They've taken Chinese for a good number of years. There was a great, oh gosh, I don't even remember. I think it was a real life lore video who had it had literally just come out on YouTube like 10 to 15 minutes before the start of class. The video was on China's social credit score system, which is being rolled out this year. So I had like a lesson planned for that class already. The lesson that was planned was talking about like, good habits, 好习惯,不好的习惯. It was like kind of circling around that structure, vocabulary surrounding that. And then all of a sudden this YouTube video pops up about China's like social credit system. The video is in English, by the way. But I was like looking at this, I'm just like, knowing that class, knowing the set of kids in that class, all I could think to myself was like, man, this is such a good opportunity. I don't know if this would fly, because the social credit system that as a topic is hugely controversial. And I think you could make just as reasonable a case, to be like, talking about this does not have an immediate relevance in the Chinese teaching classroom, and it, has the potential to kind of perpetuate stereotypes about China and Chinese people and the Chinese state, if not handled correctly or with care. already many Americans know of China, especially in this day and age, as being this like Orwellian state that's super oppressive and whatever. And like whether or not there's like how much truth there is to that, that's a subject for another discussion. But if kids already have that stereotype, why then build into it even more, right? But at the same rate, though, like if you're looking at that as like, this is a stereotype that exists, why not then spend time to look at the complexities and nuances and discuss it in a meaningful way? And so that's kind of what I chose to do. We started out just watching this video, and the video itself, I have to the credit of Real Life Lore, is a very, like, I feel very fair and balanced video. Really what it was like, the system has been rolled out on a micro scale in individual cities in China. We don't know what the nationwide system will look like, because the Chinese government has been very tight-lipped on what how it's going to be implemented or what it'll look like. But we can kind of make a couple of guesses as to how it'll look like based on how it's been rolled out in these smaller cities. And so that's kind of how the video angles itself. I'll post that in the show notes as well, so you can take a look at it. It's not a bad video. And so we kind of looked at it from that angle. We watched the video together, and then the way that I kind of framed the discussion was like, the way that the social credit system works is that like it's really, addressing problems that happen in society, problems that happen in communities, and it's a way to discourage those behaviors. And like who wants to live in a place where people don't pick up after their dogs? Like who wants to live in a place where people, allow their children to use the bathroom using a public trash can, like things of that nature. But what comes as what the point of contention ends up being is like, okay, should the punishment for not picking up after your dog be for the government to then confiscate your dog, which some of my students thought was like absolutely barbaric. But to then push back on that, to say like, well, how else will you make the case that you should pick up for your dog just because it's the right thing to do? Well, how do you who gets to define what the right thing to do is? How do you convince people that to do the right thing if it doesn't directly benefit them, right? Things of that nature. And that, to me, is a really valuable discussion that extends beyond the reach of just like, oh, this country is just so totalitarian that it just needs to exercise its control on all the people's lives in that way. It keeps them from flattening their perception of a country, of a people group. Doesn't justify what's happening in that country as being right or wrong, but it increases the level of nuance to which they can see these issues that I think, again, coming from a Western perspective, you can just kind of look and say, that doesn't align with what I'm used to, that doesn't align with my values, and so therefore I'm not going to give it the time of day. I think at the very least, while staying as politically neutral as possible, I think the value in having that sort of discussion, to even broaching that topic to begin with, I think that is, immediately relevant to the language learning classroom. Because if you're going to be someone who speaks Chinese, but your perception of Chinese people is that like, oh, they're all brainwashed and they live under this totalitarian state, how are you going to connect with them, right? How are you going to be able to see them as an equal, and how are you going to make friends with them in any way without, passing judgment on them already? And so, kids pick up on lack of authenticity. Kids pick up on fakeness anywhere. And so you can't, for them to know something like, because all my kids in that class knew, had at least heard of the social credit system happening in China. And if they were to ask about it, and your response to it as a teacher is like, oh yeah, that's something that like, it's like, this, and you give a very blasé answer that really tells them nothing, and it really just kind of shows that you're trying to skirt the problem, skirt answering their question. Like they pick up on that right away, right? They're not going to see that as a satisfying answer. And so if that's being the case, then why be fake around each other, right? Like why not address things authentically if you're in an environment, again, that really encourages that, which again, I think my school really does. Or if anything, like the particular set of kids that I am blessed with in my Chinese classes really allows that to happen. And so, so there's like that, right? I feel like that's the case for like, bringing politics into the Chinese classroom. Not necessarily taking a stance necessarily, but there's, I think, many people who would make the argument to say like, teaching Chinese culture does not require you to even touch on the question of like what does China's government do? What is China's government like, right? Because the thing is, like, I feel like that bears addressing, if only because that is actually kind of the context through which kids are understanding China now. And again, if they're not learning about China anywhere else besides your language classroom, kind of feels like it's a little incumbent on the Chinese teacher to address that in a meaningful way. So there's that, right? But let's take this one step further, since we're talking about the issue of social justice, right? What then of students who then broach the idea of like, hey, Miss So-and-so, so-and-so 老师, like, what do you think about what's happening in Xinjiang? What do you think about Tibet? What do you think about Hong Kong? And I think those are like, again, like, could be just passing questions that students have, like, oh, I heard this thing on the news. I don't know anything about it, but I know my teacher probably has a better idea. Just curious, want to know what's happening, right? And I think, like, again, like, if you think about it that way, if you could justify it saying, oh, the student probably doesn't think that much about it. Like, if I give a blasé, like non-answer, it will hurt neither them nor me. So why give myself trouble? I think you could make a case for that. I think, like, a lot of the times, yeah, it's true. Like, I think there are some students that sometimes they're just asking a question just for the sake of it. They don't expect a super in-depth answer. And so, you kind of have to, like, gauge the student based on, like, what you're dealing with. But again, in the same line, I've been broached with those same questions before. Like, what do you think about what's happening in Hong Kong? What do you think about, like, all these things? Tibet. And again, it's just as easy to look at that and be like, this has no place to be talked about in the Chinese language classroom. If my job as a Chinese language teacher is to teach you Chinese language, then why in the world are we talking about these highly controversial topics for which there is no clear moral answer to any of this, right? But at the same time, right, then I think it then goes back to, like, what do you value as an educator, right? And what kind of values are you trying to instill in your students that extend beyond just acquisition of knowledge, right? As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I know of very few educators who just teach just for the sake of transmitting material and knowledge to their students and not much else. I think people who are in this profession for the long run are here because they, again, have a vested interest in molding a future that is morally upright and just and compelled to make the world a better and safe place for everyone. At least that is in my dream scenario, right? I feel like, are the dream scenarios of many teachers, whether or not, like, given our collective experience, whether or not we think that that is a possibility, I think varies. But I think, again, the way that you would address something like this, or the way that you would, kind of factor, is this something that I want to kind of bring up in my classroom, really, again, goes back to why are you a teacher in the first place? Again, like, I think for me, in the broadest sense, it will, as long as I'm teaching in the United States, like I said before, it always goes back to the fact that, the purpose of education in a democratic society where we have voters, rights, universal suffrage, is that, that is only contingent upon the fact that your citizenry is well educated, right, and is informed on civic affairs and by relation things that are happening in the world, and in a greater sense, right, if you want to make this I don't know, like a little less neutral, a little more like kind of ideologically has a more of an ideological point, it's kind of like, in order for you to be work within democratic system, like, you need to understand the value of democracy. You need to understand the value of your vote and why it is important that you get to vote. And so that being the case, like, when issues concerning Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet, when issues of, like, human rights and political equity and, justice come up within the context of understanding China, man, I think on the one hand, it's not right to be like, American democracy is flawless, and therefore anything that is not American democracy is therefore anathema. That's not right? That, I think, is something that I actually, as a teacher, would actively push against my students who raise that as being the end all be all, like, any kind of this suggestion that, like, oh man, if only China functioned like America, everything would be better. Well, there's a lot of layers to that. But on the other hand, I think it's really important for my students to look at an example like, I won't even say Hong Kong. I think even, man, I maybe I'll get into, like, some trouble for for saying that I did this, but the day after, or the weekend, the Monday after the presidential elections in Taiwan, I spent some time in my classes talking about the presidential elections in Taiwan. Not necessarily because of the election outcome itself, but we talked about voter turnout. We talked about like, you know, the fact that like voting in Taiwan is actually really like challenging. Like really, it's not like, you know, in the US where you just like step into a school gym and fill in like a bubble and then like, you know, slide into a machine, you're done. In that it's like a very involved process. There's no absentee voting, number one. And so we talked about how like people would fly back to or take the travel back to their hometowns if they're living in Taiwan, right? Like, you know, if you travel back to their hometown in order just to vote because they had to physically be there, or if they lived abroad to fly back home just to vote, like spend money on a plane ticket so they could vote. We talked about like what would compel someone to feel the need to do that, and do we have the same, you know, same sort of conviction in the U.S. You know, and what then, you know, what kind of history would then compel people to make that sort of sacrifice to exercise their right to vote. We talked about on that level, right? Things like that, right? I think it's valuable to you know, to look at these issues concerning you know, again, civic awareness in the world language classroom. I think those opportunities come up if you choose to see them. And I think they come up if they're in line with your goals as an educator. I don't know. I really hope that there are other Chinese teachers. I know for a fact that there are other language teachers who have a similar vision. And I think again, like if you're a Spanish teacher listening to this, you're like, well, duh, like everything that I'm saying is not revolutionary in any way whatsoever, right? Again, if only because, like, you know, number one, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think at least in the United States, social justice issues feel a lot more proximate to the Spanish speaking classroom. And perhaps it's just a lot less controversial as well. Perhaps it's controversial in the sense that, like, you'll have students who have differing political opinions, you know, on immigration, things like that. But I don't know. I don't think there is like a looming, like, foreign sort of like, you know, power that could possibly, you know, affect your career, or affect your department's, you know, like, you know, the standing of your school. You know, there isn't this sort of like great looming existential, you know, external pressure coming at you. For Chinese, I think there is. What I'm meaning by all this is that, like, with Chinese, there are many other factors that play into how politically and social justicely engaged you can be in your classroom. And I think this is something that, like, you know, again, I'm 6 years into my career. I'm a newbie at this. I feel like there are a lot of things about how I'm approaching this that do still feel extremely naive. And I think, you know, hey, if you have critiques about this, or if you're an experienced teacher and you're hearing me mouth on about this and you're like, oh man, you are going to really land yourself in some trouble in the future if you continue doing this. Yeah, let's start a dialogue. Because this is something that, like, I feel is kind of challenging to navigate. And I think because it's challenging to navigate, particularly in the Chinese teaching world, it's something that, like, we'll just always be like, let's just not talk about it, right? And I think, yeah, as a Chinese teacher, if your goal is to teach language, I think you could very well just kind of like leave that as your answer and not ever touch these thorny topics and be good with it and still be a really good teacher. My argument will be, like, you know, our students are engaged in global affairs and are more interconnected with the world in ways that you know, are unprecedented, and they know much more about China and the Chinese speaking world through just what they learn on the internet than what our classes could offer to them, you know, superficially, just on a whim. That what they have exposure to is much more than what we can control, I think is what I'm saying. You know, you cannot help that if your student, you know, decides to read, like, you know, go on an internet binge on what's happening in Xinjiang, and then they come to your class and then ask you a bunch of questions. What are you going to say? I think if anything, regardless of your stance on this as a Chinese teacher, I think, that's something that you have to have a good answer for. If only because, again, like, why are students at school, what are their expectations when they see a teacher? They expect to learn something from them, right? Or they expect for their teacher to have some sort of knowledge that they did not have in the first place. And because of that expectation, I think it's worthwhile for, at least for me, at least for Chinese teachers to seriously think about how they will 应付 that, how they will, I don't know, face that, how they will get through that situation. And get through it well in a way that isn't just like dancing around the question, and so that you can kind of get to the point. But I think at the same time as I'm saying this, seems like kind of like, oh man, this is a problem that we have to kind of like 应付, have to kind of like deal with and get over. But I think this is all, going back to like the talk back that I had tonight with my students, where, you're talking about institutional racism in part perpetuated by American Christians in the South. Talking about this at a Christian school, evangelical school, where, you have students who for whom like the bad guys in this movie, Just Mercy, seem very real to them, right? This is a thorny issue in that context. Again, like, this is something that like when I've talked to friends who are Christian who don't work in these contexts, they're like, why in the world is an evangelical Christian school talking about racial justice to begin with? Those two things don't match. And yet in my mind, in the minds of like many people, as they should, those things are, almost inevitable topics that come together. And so if they're inevitable, just as inevitable as it is for a student to come up to the Chinese teacher and ask them about what's happening in Tibet, what's happening in Hong Kong, you need to have a good answer for that. And how do you get a good answer for that? I think as a teacher, it's kind of like, it has to become a part of your own personal lexicon. It has to be a part of your own sort of what you think about on the day-to-day. I want to say that this is not particularly hard for educators. Again, for those educators who are in it for the long run, I think, again, you can't be invested in this kind of work unless you have a long-term perspective as to what the future ought to look like and how our young people have a role in that. But I think the job of, or even the question of, regardless of your disciplinary area, regardless of which subject you teach, the question of what are you doing in your classroom to talk about Martin Luther King Day? I think the answer to that question comes a lot easier if the issues of social justice are something that you think about personally on a regular basis, and they become a lot harder if it's not something that you engage with yourself at all. And I think, again, like, all sorts of people go into education for different reasons. I'm not saying that like everyone has to have a unified mission to promote racial justice in their own classrooms. I think, I've heard enough from other people who are like, hey, I'm in this job to like, do XYZ, and this is not something that really is in my own sort of like sphere of things. But I don't know. I feel like if this is something that's popping up, this idea of like integrating racial justice in your classroom, whether it's popping up because like it's a district requirement, whether it's coming up from administration, whether it's a departmental thing, or whether it's because your students are asking you questions about this. I think if it's becoming more prominent part of your experience as a teacher, and you're having trouble trying to figure out how you're going to make that work in your classroom, I think a great place to start is like engaging yourself in the issues. Because I realized that like those teachers for whom these issues are part of something they care about, on their day-to-day, it naturally seeps into what they do in the classroom in a way that, again, is ethical, and that is not like agenda pushing, and that for the overarching goal is to get students to think harder and to have more empathy with other humans and to understand the world a little better. And I think it's really hard to kind of say that any of those values are political or controversial in any way. So that being said, I hope you enjoyed this very long, unorganized ramble on what is a really important topic, and I hope I didn't bungle anything too horribly or get myself into any trouble. Again, the main goal of me doing this podcast is to connect with people who are asking the same questions as I am. I recognize that a lot of people who are listening to this probably aren't Chinese teachers. I don't think there's a lot of us out there to begin with, and so the likelihood of, lots of Chinese teachers being the main audience for this podcast, not likely. Anyway, let me know what you thought about this. I'd love to hear feedback. If you want to follow this podcast just for regular update podcasts, these sort of things, you can definitely do that on Instagram. We are at Bad Chinese Teacher, on Twitter, Bad Chinese Pod, and Facebook. Just search us up. But something I've been doing for those of you who have managed to find me personally on social media, I love feedback there as well. You can find me at Patricia Liu on on Instagram, at Patricia Liu at Twitter. But yeah, again, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And I do respond to those thoughts as well. Those of you who have been DMing me, I don't mind that. So let me know what you think, and whether or not this is something you'd like to hear more of. Another thing you can also do, if that's a little too forward for you, is that you can also leave this podcast a review on Apple Podcasts. Just hop down to, if you're using Apple Podcasts, or even if you're not, just click on or tap on the name of the podcast, scroll all the way down, hit that 5-star rating, and write me a little review, letting me know and letting others know why this podcast is worth their while, because I know there's a lot of choices you can make for your podcast listening choices, and I'm glad that you're making this one of them. So thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week to talk about something that is related but it is Chinese, or no, it's rather Lunar New Year. We'll talk about that distinction next week. It's Lunar New Year that's coming up, and I have a lot of thoughts about that. And so if you're looking for more ramble from me, please subscribe so that you'll catch that episode when it comes out next week. But until then, I hope you have a delightful rest of your week. That being said, I will see you next week. Bye-bye.